Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you to our conference, The Rise of Evil Empire, yesterday and today. First of all, I would like to welcome Dr. Robert Vender, who is the director of the Institute of National Remembrance, and he will take the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to welcome you to our branch in Lublin, the branch of the Institute of National Remembrance. The branch is quite close to Ukraine, who was attacked by today's Russia. Russia, who is led by the man who directly takes reference to the Soviet times. The person who told that the collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the greatest tragedies of the 20th century. He was quite open that in his policies he will take reference to the times of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is certainly an embodiment of a particular thought that grasped a number of people already in the 19th century. Communism tried to antagonize certain groups of people against each other. It was supposed to be an opposition to the previous epoch. It was based on the oppositions between the genders, between different classes. It was a continuous antagonism and battle between those. As we have seen, this resulted in deaths of millions of people. If this, of course, when faced with such a situation, this inevitably had to lead to deaths. Actually, the history of the Soviet Union is the history of deaths of people who died in the fight for liberation. So we could ask actually the question, what is the relationship between the freedom and the enslavement? Of course, Poland also experienced that in a particular way. After World War II, we were under the influence of the Soviet Union. After so many years of the Sovietization of Poland, we were also forced to introduce martial law, and we were forced to actually introduce tanks to our streets in order to break free from that system. Of course, the system had nothing to do with liberation. It was actually terror. You can't liberate people through sowing death. We are really pleased to have the opportunity to host a number of eminent guests today. This conference is, among others, also dedicated to the youth. Because they can actually take up that thought. What we see today is actually the continuation of the process. We can see it in Ukraine today. The evil empire somehow still continues today. We are quite fortunate that this war does not affect us so directly as the Ukrainians. But, of course, we have to be prepared. That's why I'm very happy that there are also the representatives of military services among us. What is important is the sovereignty, for sure. Without it, without a sovereign, in a country that's not sovereign, we could not be talking about economy and freedom and democracy. I would like us to directly delve into the topic. I would like us to look at the history, but also to look forward to the challenges that we will have probably we will have to face in the future. And now the floor will be taken by the president of the Memory of Nations Foundations. Good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, I won't be presenting the history of the Evil Empire. Certainly, this will resurface in the discussion later on. I would like to tell you that our leitmotif, certainly, will be the speech by President Ronald Reagan, delivered in 1983, who used this term, the Evil Empire, to refer to the Soviet Union. The totalitarian system was, of course, quite evil, and we have to remember that it has particular faces. You can see some of them in our poster, and certainly there will be other figures mentioned by our panelists. Those are people who were partially judged, but not all of them were actually convicted. And the war is actually still ongoing on our eastern border. Russia still tries to change the borders in our part of Europe. We can't allow them to do that. The evil must be stopped at every level. That is why that's the direct motivation for this conference. This is the common initiative by the Memory of Nation Foundation and the Institute of National Remembrance. We also cooperated with the industry, with the IDA, and banks and some other agencies. I cited the words by President Ronald Reagan, but I would like to finish with the words by Winston Churchill. He said, "Communists are like crocodiles, who, when they open their jaws, we are not sure whether they are smiling or they want to devour us." Was he actually right or not? Well, probably, I hope, we will be able to answer during the panel discussions. Thank you. And now we are starting with the first panel. I'm giving a voice to Dr. Saczewicz. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our first panel. I would like to welcome all the guests, Professor Marek Konrad, Professor Marek Wierzbicki, Dr. Janek Szumski. Professor Saczewicz is the director of our delegature in Szczecin. Olsztyn. Once again, welcome to all of you. Our panel will be discussing the instruments and tools that were sometimes visibly, but sometimes quite camouflaged, used by the Soviet Union and Russia to lead the policy of subjugating the world, but also the citizens of their own territory. That's why in this panel we will be talking about those tools used and implemented by Moscow. Professor Marek Konrad, who is a Sovietologist and is particularly interested in foreign policies, he will be the one that I would like to ask first. So, was there actually the principle of peaceful coexistence between Poland and the Soviet Union, and generally between Soviet Union and other partners on the international arena? How was it used by Moscow in the first half of the 21st century, especially if it comes to the relationship with Poland? Right. The answer to this question is quite easy. Actually, it was not the case. That is, the Soviet Union was not really interested or striving to peacefully coexist with the surrounding countries. Of course, they were creating a narrative that was used as a kind of propaganda to influence the awareness of people. Maybe this awareness is not as present in Poland or not as strong, but this could be quite clearly seen in the West, especially if you think about the academic circles in the West. That's why we can hear about the very caricatural vision of how the Second World War actually broke out. This could be connected with another question about the vessel order. And was it possible that the world could endure in peace? Actually, World War II is presented as an act done by one actor, that is Hitler. He started the war just as he wanted. So, actually, we can't contradict that, but there was yet another empire, totalitarian empire, which was Soviet Union. That also helped the Nazi Germany in the Second World War by entering into Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. This was actually one of the aims and the crowning achievement of Stalin's policy. At the time of World War II, when two totalitarian empires were waging the war and then entered into a long-term military conflict, contributed to the emergence of a very positive military situation for the Soviet Union, because they could enter the intermarean region, saying that they are actually liberating the people inhabiting that area. The Soviet Union was partially blocked in its actions before the war, because it was also blocked to a great extent by Poland, the Second Polish Republic. But as we well know, the situation changed when the war broke out, and in the process, the Soviet Union could actually capture the territory, seize the territories in the intermarean region. Of course, the Soviet Union is perceived quite often despite our knowledge about how the internal policy was created there, despite the displacement of nations, creating hunger in Ukraine, extermination of ethnic minorities. We could refer to the Polish action. We have to think about the terror. And despite all those aspects, very often historians forget to acknowledge that such a state could not pursue a peaceful policy.
A mianowicie teorię, która zakłada stworzenie.
So the Soviet Union had to create a kind of defensive system against Germany, the center of which had to be, of course, Russia. In 1934, such a project was envisioned and was implemented in two phases, in 34 and 35. And of course, the Marshal Pilsudski and the Minister Beck rejected such a proposal. At that time, it was not yet an ultimatum. This proposed bloc of common defense that was supposed to include the Baltic states, Czechoslovakia and Poland, would need the Red Army to enter the Polish territory already in the peacetime, because the Red Army would have to be ready to engage Germany quite early on. Of course, such a decision would be like a death sentence for the nation. That is why such a proposal could not be really processed positively. But the idea of the common security, joint security, which was also proposed in the League of Nations, was pursued first there, and the Russia tried to implement such a policy in the League.
Stabilizacji kapitalizmu, która się powieść nie może.
It was about stabilizing the capital system. Unfortunately, the League of Nations was used for pacifist policies, and this was what the Soviet Union did. Their policy was quite fierce in this way. When in 1932 a conference in Geneva met, the Soviet Union proposed to disband all the armies around the world. But irrespective of that, the whole idea of the common defense have some supporters even today. Maybe the war in Ukraine for today would change the minds of certain people. But when talking about the historiography, especially in the Western edition, the Soviet idea of the common defense was perceived as something positive, and it was also used as an argument against Poland, who was opposed to that. We have to remember that Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was preceded by the military agreements between the Soviet Union and other countries. And again, the Polish government also rejected the proposal of the Soviet Union to get onto the territory of Poland militarily. Poland is perceived very often as a country that had a destructive role in that process. So, for instance, you can even hear such arguments from Sergio Romano, an Italian professor, who claimed that Poland did not want to make arrangements with a stronger neighbor. Of course, this is quite shocking when you hear that, but this shows quite clearly the intricate nature of the problem. Of course, we have to admit certain aspects, like the destructive nature of the Soviet Union in 1939, and also the liberation of the Eastern Europe or the Intermarium region. We have to emphasize that the Soviet Union played an important role in destabilizing international order after the Paris peace conference in 1919. Of course, we can take reference to the Treaty of Rapallo, help Germany with armament. The Soviet Union and earlier even the Imperial Russia were playing an important, very destructive role, concealing their real face. Let me just add that the ambitions, the expansive ambitions, there was a discussion about the name of the state. Some people proposed to say it should be named the Socialist Republic of the States of Europe and Asia, but some claimed this would not go along with the general aims of that state.
So we should pay attention to one thing. If we talk about different conceptions of theory of security coming from Russia, we should stay alert and remember that the Russian theories of liberation is about enslaving nations. So, Professor Wierzbicki, I have a question to you. Sovietization, what was it? What were the characteristics, the main features? With reference to Poland and other nations. When we talk about the Sovietization, we should define the concept first. So it's about imposing by the Soviet Union on other countries and nations their own patterns of economy, cultural patterns, language patterns, including imposing the Russian language, and also forcing those people to accept the way of living of Russians. And it is a very important tool of enslaving nations and countries, because the idea was for those people to forget about their own culture, their own way of being, and for them to accept the new situation and accept the being subordinate to the Soviet Union. And the idea was for them to accept that this is a normal state. So what's surprising is that the whole process didn't start in 1939 with the Poles, but it began in the interwar period, actually, because Poland was an important opponent of Russians. In 1920, the Poles were the ones who stopped the Russians, which brought anger of Lenin. Poland and the Poles constituted one of the most important components of the Versailles Order created by the Versailles Treaty in Europe. And the Soviet Union, as in a way an anti-system state, wanted to destroy this new Versailles Order and wanted to create and impose their own order. So the most important thing was to prepare the destruction of Poland in order for Poland to be able to accept the Russian domination. And the idea was also to prepare the citizens of Poland, both in Poland and in Russia, to accept the ideals of communism, of their ideals, and Homo Sovietikus ideals. So people were subject to this process of subordination. And of course, we'll have other panelists talking about that, so I'm not going to delve more into the topic. But one of the ways the Soviet Union wanted to change and transform Poles into partisans of their ideology was to give autonomy to some regions close to the border. And this is how two regions were created, Dzierżyńszczyzna and Malvęszczyzna in the Republic of Ukraine. And those two regions were, in a way, artificially created. Poles were given a lot of autonomy in those areas. And schools were established, different cultural facilities were created, roads were built, everything to make Poles cooperate with the Russian Union, but it also played a propaganda role for the Polish workers in Poland. And the idea was not successful. In the end, Stalin changed his policy, as we know, and he started his policy of massive terror. And those Poles who were so much loved by the Soviet government, they kept their values. They did not want to give up their Polish culture and Polish tradition and religion. And the approach was anti-Soviet, which was obvious during the collectivization period, where actually the opposition was really strong. In 1936, when the grand deportation from Ukraine was started, from Ukraine to Kazakhstan, of 1,000 people, and then the so-called Polish action started. And this was the very first action that was against one nation. And this was a policy of genocide of the Poles. As someone said, being a Pole in 1938 in the Soviet Union was like as if in the same way or similar to being a Jew in Germany. So 111 Poles were arrested, sent to death sentences, to labor camps. Probably around 200,000 people were victims of this action. But the idea was to destroy the leaders or the leadership fought in the Polish nation, to force the Poles to accept the order imposed by Stalin. And then in 1931, in Poland, on the territory of Poland, the same idea was used when the process of Sovietization of these areas started, and they wanted to incorporate those areas into the Soviet Union. First of all, it was about destroying the elites and Polish institutions by extermination of the elites, marginalization of them, but also the idea was to create new Soviet institutions, introducing new Soviet elites that would be responsive to the Soviet government. What was characteristic about this period were the repressions. We know also about the Katyn crime, the Katyn massacre, in which so many people died because they opposed the Soviet power. A lot of Poles were deported as well. And the idea was to cleanse the territory from the unwanted element. And of course, after the war, Stalin did not decide to incorporate Poland directly into the Soviet Union, but he used those experiences, those previous experiences, to first of all subordinate Poland and invade Poland, including their institutions, exterminating intellectuals, and at the same time he tried to create and establish his own elites, institutions which helped him subordinate Poland later on. So, if the situation was not good for the Russian ideas, then new countries, satellite countries were created, which were actually Russian colonies, in fact. I have a question to Professor Szumski. When we talk about this process of Sovietization and Russification, what was the approach, the policy of Russia towards this great family of nations, of republics that made part of the evil empire named USSR? Ladies and gentlemen, Professor, I think it's worth referring to our past events, which is, by the way, the subject of our conference. In 1922, December 30, 4 Soviet republics, As we know, including Armenia and Georgia, the four republics started a treaty, a pact to create the whole one pact. And the process of the creation lasted for 30 years. Already in the 20s, there were very heated discussions concerning the shape and the way of organizing the regime and system of this new state, whether it should be a federation, more centralized a system or model, which Stalin was for, who was, as we know, the commissary for the issues concerning nationality. He was perceived as a specialist in that matter. And finally, the federalist idea one, put forward by Lenin. In 1920s, through the process of delimitation of nations, this Soviet Republic was divided, and Middle Asia part was taken from it. New republics were founded, Uzbekistan among others, and Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. In 1939, as a result of the Russian aggression on Poland, the occupied areas of the Republic of Poland were included and joined to the republics, Russian republics. After the Soviet aggression on Finland and following the signing of a treaty that thanks to which Finland could gain some form of autonomy and independence. In 1920, the Finland Soviet Republic was created, and the Karelska Autonomous Republic followed, which existed until 1956. In 1940, August, the Moldavia Socialist Republic was created. Part of Romania was in it. And three Baltic republics as well were created.
What about the policy of Moscow concerning those territories? Was it actually uniform if it comes to the entire country, or was it adapted to a particular territory? So, on the one hand, of course, they had to somehow deal it, not only on the entire national scale, but also concerning the particular parts, in order to secure the Moscow's interest. I would like to. I apologize for all this long introduction, but I think it is actually quite important to make it in order to understand the internal working of the state. So, of course, the different republics were treated differently. So, for instance, in the Constitution of 1977, the Russian Soviet Republic was the most important. The second one was Ukrainian, later on the Belarusian, and on the fifth place, for instance, we've got the Estonian Republic. That's why the policy concerning the particular republics was differentiated and varied. So we can say that certain staff in those republics, in some of those territories, was more privileged. Especially, there were certain agreements with local authorities or people in power, but generally the central activists or the staff was given the precedence. This was especially the case with less urbanized and developed areas. We could say this was actually a part of their policy. This was part of the policy which was called korenizacja, which is from the Russian term core. In the 1930s, there was a change in the adopted policy. We deal with industrialization and centralization of the state. That's why all the national experiments were not supported. In the case of more developed republics, for instance, in the Baltic states, Baltic republics, and other republics from the Eastern European part, the policy was a bit different, depending on the particular situation and sympathies. Our image of the Soviet policy is of pacifism, liberation. It resembled a snake just before the attack. Very often we are talking about a particular genotype of freedom or liberation in the Soviet blood. But what's the position of the Soviet art in all that? Was the art also a propeller of that ideology? So, of course, this problem issue is quite broad, extensive. It's complicated for a number of reasons. The question whether the Soviet art and poster was an aware tool, a conscious tool used by the people in power, it's true. It was used as a kind of offensive, means of offensive. So how was it spread? And what kind of plastic form was used for this purpose? We have to remember that until 1939, starting from 1917, so about that period, it's the period of constructivism based on leftist thought, which appeared first in Moscow. But later on, it spread also to other countries, for instance, to the Netherlands. It used different plastic form of arts, taking reference to symbol
Więc jest pytanie, czy my chcemy tylko o tym powiedzieć, czy chcemy powiedzieć o tym, jakie to były treści. A więc mamy
But what about the
sytuację,
content?
w związku z tym to będą tylko absolutnie sygnały pokazujące ikonograficzne przedstawienia, które gdzieś w kilku zagadnieniach spróbujemy krótko.
So we will try to take a look at that. So one of the reasons was to get rid of the impurities in the world. This was a kind of caricature on the world, and this was a kind of message directed especially at common people. It wasn't then the target were not the intellectual elites. The message was quite drastic when it comes to Poland, for instance, because it was portrayed as a dog that is serving Western European countries, in particular France, or, for instance, Poland presented as a pig.
Obecności wiemy, jak ta formuła plastyczna była kształtowana przez Związek Sowiecki. Opracowania w tym obszarze mamy dosyć duże.
We have a number of different studies that actually depict and try to describe all those portrayals. Actually, the area of this plastic form of expression is quite extensive. So, for instance, here you can see Polish anti-Soviet posters. And again, here we've got posters, caricatures, special publishing materials. This was used as a kind of antidote against the Soviet threat and the Red Army. Also the Bolshevik movement.
Pokazać, w jaki sposób ta plastyka. O, tutaj mamy przykład.
Here, for instance, we can see an example of artistically well-formed posters based on avant-garde, taking reference to history. Here we've got Surolov's grandchildren, depicting the Soviet soldier who is supposed to liberate the entire world. Those were the posters from 1918 until 1940. The Soviet Union is actually supposed to be prepared. It's assumed they should be ready, both men and women, as you can see here in the posters. They should be ready for the aggression on the part of the Western world. So this is actually the states, the United States of America, and the Western Europe that are the main enemies of the Soviet Union, because they are actually they are the part of the legacy of Hitler. This is a very good example. Here we can see a depiction of a German post-Nazi thought that should actually go into a precipice. Oh, for instance, here we see how the United States are portrayed, or the Great Britain. It also depicts generally the threat, any threat that is posed to the Soviet Union.
Które później się pojawi w naszej dyskusji. Jaki był odbiór tejże sztuki?
What was the reception
poza imperium zła,
of art outside of the borders of the Evil Empire? What were also the consequences? It's quite complicated.
odbiór przekazu artystycznego
Because the reception of the artistic message is quite unambiguous, quite clear
taką tendencję do
in the United States, but also in Western Europe. There is a tendency to be very amazed at this type of artistic message, but without actually understanding the nature of the evil empire. There are numerous contemporary collectors of such works of art. They are quite popular in the art market. They are even viewed as real pieces of art.
Odbiór sztuki jest bardzo niewymierny, jeżeli chodzi o policzalność, prawda?
Of course, it's difficult to talk about the effect of the art and how it is received. But now, in the context of foreign policy, in the context of the naivety of the Western world,
co udowodniły wydarzenia ostatnich miesięcy, bardzo mocno pytanie, czy naiwnie w kierunku rosyjskim działał?
I would like to ask, can we actually tell that the West acts quite naively in this context? How the situation looked like in the interwar period? Did the Soviets try to establish their bases in the Western countries? Were the Western countries unaware of the possible consequences of their cooperation, or they were going along with the Soviet Union? So we are talking about the interwar period, so without taking recourse to World War II. The Soviet state, after becoming one of the most important players in the international policy making,
negacji, krytyki. Słynna jest wypowiedź, zresztą prawdziwa, premiera francuskiego, Georgesa Clemenceau.
We think about the claim of the French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau. He said at the end of 1919, at the same time, the leftist parties, for instance, the British Labour Party, were quite unambiguously pro-Soviet in their dealing. So certainly there were certain agents exerting their influence on the British policy. Because the Soviet Union tried to rationalize, or actually the Western countries tried to rationalize the policy of the Soviets. The Russian Empire was a despotic country under Tsars. That was based so socialism was considered as a kind of progress. At least in the 1920s, people still thought so. Hollander, the American Sovietologist, the French Prime Minister Herriot visited the Soviet Union, and in his vision,
były prezes Rady Ministrów jedzie do ZSRR. Można więc powiedzieć tak, że obraz negacji państwa sowieckiego
We can say that the image of the Soviet Union certainly is weakened.
A w każdym razie życzliwie spoglądających na to państwo. I ci ludzie występują przede wszystkim w kołach lewicowych i liberalnych, tak to trzeba powiedzieć.
It's weakened, but we've got different circles of people. So on the one hand, we've got conservatives and leftists. So the leftists are pro-Soviet and the Democrats are, of course, against. In 1933, we've got a certain shift. It's the time when Hitler comes to power, and he was actually conducting a policy of action.
Niemcy prowadzą politykę faktów dokonanych, łamiąc rozmaite.
In this way, Nazi Germany violated a number of different international treaties. For instance, they remilitarized North Rhine region, introduced compulsory military service, and pursued a policy of territorial conquest. Under such circumstances, there are more and more supporters, especially in the leftist circles, the supporters of the thesis that the Soviets should be convinced to help the German cause. For instance, Churchill was in favor of creating a kind of axis between London, Paris, and Moscow. And of course, at that time, we deal with generally the policy of appeasement.
Moment zaistnienia na nowo koncepcji starań o sojusz ze Związkiem Sowieckim. Mnie się wydaje, że pod wpływem przeobrażeń polityki międzynarodowej i pod wpływem działania Hitlera maleje liczba przeciwników Związku Sowieckiego, słabnie antykomunizm.
So actually, the anti-communist is weakened at that time, and this is all because of the influence of Hitler and his policies. Even if the Soviet state is pursuing a policy that is not in line with the Western ideas, political ideas, the country still should cooperate somehow with it against Germany, creating in this way a united front. What is worth considering is that in the 1930s, the Soviet regime is the time of the greatest terror, hunger, and compulsory collectivization in the Soviet state. That's the time of extermination of the entire ethnic groups and displacement.
Administrację, partię, wojsko sowieckie. Otóż pod wpływem tych
and the influence of these changes, the international role of the Soviet Union is not diminished.
Polityka sowiecka
The Soviet policy
w samym czasie jest ofensywnie prowadzona
is at the same time quite offensive in nature. They create a narrative about peaceful coexistence and the joint security, which has been discussed already before. No one is asking the question whether the country pursuing such terrorist policy internally can actually pursue a peaceful policy on the international arena. If it comes to the British archives or the French archives, it's actually difficult to find this question or the answer to that question there. A French historian, Furet, about 20 years ago said something very important. He said that Soviet communism under the influence of the action in the 1930s would have lost its attractiveness if it had not pursued the theory of anti-fascism. So the main idea was that the Soviet state is the main power fighting against fascism. And this idea caught up also among the intellectual elites in the West. And this in particular makes communism quite attractive. And from this perspective, people actually forgot about the other aspects of communism. So, when the Soviet constitution has been adopted, so it was about 19 years after the upheaval, political upheaval. So anti-fascism actually revives the communist ideology. So it seems that Moscow is quite apt at dealing with the difficult situations to resurface again, to come back to the mainstream of political ideology.
Moskwy gdzieś w polityczno-międzynarodowy niebyt są mrzonką, bo tak naprawdę Moskwa ma tą zdolność wpływania w
Moscow is still quite active and quite capable of influencing the mainstream thought. So we should actually appreciate Moscow and its ability to influence the current policies. But the next question should be, where are the allies of the Soviets and Sovietization? So we discussed the Polish context, but what about the other nations?
As you already said, the Soviet Union was really capable to be reborn and to get its position back. And even the attack on Germany on the Soviet Union made the Soviet Union stay in the limelight and be part of the and thanks to that, during the different conferences in Potsdam, Tehran, Yalta, they achieved what they wanted, so they managed to keep their position. So those countries with a long history, tradition and culture of being states were not incorporated into one country, but what was created was a system of satellite countries in a way functioning as colonies. But first of all, they needed to conquer those countries.
wyzwolili ten kraj i
the
oni nam dyktowali
communists
warunki od początku.
themselves
To nie było trudne. To był pierwszy model,
dictated their
można powiedzieć,
own
wstępnej
rules,
sowietyzacji, podboju.
and the first stage
Drugi
of
model
Sovietization
to było, kiedy włączono niektóre
involved that.
terytoria państwa
Second
do bezpośredniego Związku
stage
Sowieckiego.
involved
Znowu kraje bałtyckie
incorporating
włączyły się w
some
Związku Sowieckim,
states
tak
like
jak w
the
latach
Baltic States
1940-41.
to the
Teraz,
USSR.
po 1944 włączono je z powrotem do
After
Związku Sowieckiego. I
1944,
tam
they
z jednej
were
strony było to
brought
prostsze
back
dla
to the
Stalina, bo to
Soviet
były nieduże
Union.
kraje,
Those
obarczone
were
też
small
kolaboracją
countries
elity tych krajów z
whose
Niemcami,
elites
ale z drugiej strony tam
used to
również
collaborate with
należało
the
tworzyć tak zwane
Germans.
okresy przejściowe, a więc stworzyć
But
sobie bazę
some
polityczną, społeczną,
intermediate
przeprowadzić
periods
szereg,
were introduced
atrakcyjnych
in
reform, jak
those
reforma rolna po raz
states
kolejny
where very
przeprowadzana,
attractive reforms
likwidacja
like
wielkich majątków
agricultural
ziemskich,
reform
a równocześnie
was
stosować
introduced,
masowy terror,
and at the
deportacje,
same time
zwłaszcza,
mass terror and
Litwinów,
deportations
Estończyków
were
czy
in place
Łotyszy
of
i
the
kolonizowanie tych
Lithuanians,
obszarów
of the Estonians,
Rosjanami, przede
for
wszystkim
example.
innymi obywatelami
And of
sowieckimi
course, the
i innych
colonizations
narodowości.
of those
Natomiast
areas
trzeci
with the
model,
Russians
podboju
was
i
in place.
sowietyzacji
The third stage
polegał na,
of
na
the conquer
w cudzysłowie wyzwalaniu tych krajów Europy Środkowo-Wschodniej przez
involved
Armię Czerwoną.
liberating
Ale tam, w
those
każdym z tych krajów należało
states by the
doprowadzić
Red
do opanowania
Army.
systemu
And
politycznego i
in each
przejęcia
of
władzy przez
those
komunistów.
countries,
W takich krajach jak
the rule
Czechosłowacja
of
czy
communists
Bułgaria,
was
ruch
to be
komunistyczny był
introduced. In
dosyć
such
popularny.
countries
Tamte
as
partie miały silną
Czechoslovakia or
pozycję w
Bulgaria,
systemie politycznym, więc tam nie było problemu, że należało
it was
zaczynać
not
niemalże
an
od zera
issue
z przejęciem władzy. Natomiast w krajach takich jak Polska,
to
jak
conquer them.
Rumunia, jak
But in
Węgry,
Poland, Romania or
pozycja
Hungary,
komunistów była o wiele
the
słabsza
communist
i
position
tam
was
należało stworzyć
much
przede wszystkim
weaker.
najpierw tak zwane
And
fronty
what was
narodowe,
needed
czy bloki
was
demokratyczne,
creation of
gdzie
democratic
komuniści
blocs
ukrywali się za
first and
innymi
foremost,
partiami, które często były kryptokomunistyczne, tylko miały szyldy
actually
bardzo popularnych
those
partii
parties
przedwojennych
were
i opanowane przez agentów
crypto-communists
komunistycznych.
and they were
I w ten sposób najpierw w koalicji zmierzano do
communists
wyborów.
served, in fact.
Partie, które nie chciały wejść do
And the
takiej
parties who
koalicji, tych
didn't
bloków,
want
czy
to
frontów,
join
były
such a coalition
niszczone
of
przez
crypto-communist
terror, przez
parties
nawet morderstwa zmuszane
were
do
demolished,
emigracji.
destroyed, and
W
even
większości tych
forced
krajów
to emigrate.
wybory, które
In most of
przeprowadzono
those
parlamentarne,
countries,
były fałszowane. Tam
the
się na przykład nie
elections
udało na Węgrzech
were
stworzyć takiego frontu
falsified,
od razu.
and in
W listopadzie
Hungary,
1945 roku
in
komuniści przegrali wybory. I
1945, the
potem
communists
musieli przez kolejne
lost
2
the
lata
elections, and
jakby
for the
walczyć niemalże od
following
zera,
2
ale
years, they needed
udało im się
to
zniszczyć
fight
partię drobnych
from
rolników i
the
inne
scratch,
mniejsze
we
ugrupowania
might say, and they managed to
A
destroy
więc
some
próbowano na
petty
wszelkie sposoby
parties and unions.
zniszczyć swoich przeciwników,
So
ale
they
również
strived really hard
wchłonąć
to
potem
destroy
swoich
their
sojuszników.
enemies and
I w każdym z tych krajów
opponents.
ten proces zakończył się
In
przejęciem
each of
pełnej
those
władzy przez partię
states, the
komunistyczną, tak jak w Związku
process
Sowieckim.
ended
I stworzono
in
system monocentryczny,
conquering
czyli system,
them
w którym
and
było tylko jedno
imposing
źródło
the
decyzji
Soviet
politycznej.
system
Tym źródłem
with
była
centralized
partia
power,
komunistyczna. Wtedy zaczął się
and
drugi
the
etap,
origin, the center of
sowietyzacji,
power
tej
was
już przyspieszonej,
Soviet.
takiej
And
dogłębnej,
then
która upodabniała te
another
kraje do Związku
stage
Sowieckiego.
rendered
A więc
those
skrajna
countries
centralizacja,
look
masowy terror,
very much alike the Soviet Union.
likwidacja
So massive
niezależnych
terror
organizacji
was
społecznych
the
czy partii politycznych,
getting rid of
upaństwowienie
political
gospodarki, likwidacja
parties,
własności prywatnej. A
getting
więc
rid of
proces, który miał doprowadzić do podboju społeczeństwa, o
private
którym
property
mówimy,
and
we
so
wszystkich
on.
tych krajach
So the
Europy
process that
Wschodniej.
aimed
I myślę, że
at
należałoby się przede wszystkim
conquering the
zastanowić,
society
dlaczego
and
te
subordinating
kraje
the
zostały
society.
sowietyzowane.
So the question
proces
is
był
why
konieczny?
those
Czy nie
countries
wystarczyło,
were
tak jak
sovietized?
podobno myślał
Was it
prezydent
necessary?
Roosevelt, że kraje Europy Środkowo-Wschodniej
Roosevelt
będą uzależnione od Związku
believed
Sowieckiego w polityce zagranicznej,
To think
ale będą posiadały autonomię
that
wewnętrzną.
those countries
dosyć
would
dużą.
be
Taką,
autonomous
jaką później
internally,
uzyskała Finlandia chociażby.
like for
Co było zresztą
example
przedmiotem marzeń
the Finnish
wszelkich grup
case.
opozycyjnych w krajach bloku sowieckiego w latach 70. czy 80. Więc pytanie,
Well,
czy była
the
konieczna ta
question
sowietyzacja?
arises
Dlaczego do niej w ogóle
whether the
doszło?
Sovietization process
Są
was
różne opinie
necessary,
wśród naukowców na
why
ten
it
temat.
happened, and
Jedni twierdzą,
there
że
are
to
different
sam Zachód
ideas of
sprowokował
different
takie działania
researchers
Stalina,
about
bo
that.
nasilenie
Some say
zimnej
that
wojny
the
i
West
zagrożenie ze
provoked
strony Stanów
that,
Zjednoczonych zmusiło
that
jakby
the Cold
Stalina
War situation as if forced Stalin
skonsolidowania
to consolidate his people
ujednolicenia
and
systemów
to
politycznych,
try to
społecznych, gospodarczych
unify
tych
those
krajów, po to, żeby
economic
łatwiej było
and political
bronić się przed
systems to
agresją
be able
Zachodu.
to
Z
protect
kolei jest inny pogląd, który
themselves
mówi,
from
że
the West.
sowietyzacja była
Another opinion is
wprowadzona
that
po to,
the process of
aby
Sovietization
tak
was
naprawdę w całym bloku
introduced
sowieckim były
in
takie same
order
warunki życia, taka sama
to
mentalność ludzi,
unify the
takie same
mentality,
instytucje,
conditions of
takie same systemy
living,
polityczne i
and institutions
społeczno-gospodarcze, taka
and
sama kultura wreszcie.
political
Mimo że
and
zachowywano
cultural
języki narodowe
systems
w tych
and culture
krajach.
in all those countries.
Ja myślę, że
Even if the
można jeszcze
original
trzecią
native
interpretację
languages were
zaproponować i mi się
kept.
zdaje, że ona jest najbliższa
And
prawdy.
the
Że
third
sowietyzacja w
option
krajach
could be
podlegających
that the
Związkowi
Sovietization
Sowieckiemu,
in
w
those
krajach bloku
subordinated
sowieckiego,
nations
tak
of
naprawdę była
USSR
narzędziem, po pierwsze,
was
zniewolenia
in
tych
a way a
społeczeństw,
tool of
narzędziem
enslaving those nations,
uspokojenia własnych
but
obywateli
also
sowieckich, żeby nie czuli się
a tool of
pokrzywdzeni, że
appeasing
lepsze warunki znajdują się
Soviets'
w krajach
own
Europy Środkowo-Wschodniej,
citizens.
uzależnionych od Sowietów. Ale przede wszystkim sowietyzacja była moim zdaniem potrzebna,
But
aby móc prowadzić
before all,
dalszą ekspansję
it
imperialną
was necessary
przez Związek
to
Sowiecki.
continue
Do tego
the
potrzeba było
imperial
zedrzeć szeregi,
expansion.
ujednolicić społecznie, politycznie,
Because what was
gospodarczo
needed
społeczeństwa
was the
i dzięki
unification
temu móc
of all
potem
those
ruszyć z
nations
następnym
to be
etapem
able
ekspansji
to
imperialnej
go
na
forward
inne kraje
and
Europy
to
czy
head
regiony świata.
towards other regions of the world.
Do tej diagnozy pana profesora
So,
ostatniej.
the picture
Imperium
you've
zła to jest imperium, które
been drawing
ciągle nastawia
shows
się na
that the
ekspansję,
evil empire is
militarną.
open to expansion and ready for expansion, especially the military one, all the time. But in order to do that, you need to have some backups in different sectors, social, military, economic.
Przeprowadzić ofensywę
All that
bez
to
oglądania się
be
często wstecz.
able
I
to
to widać. A jest
conduct an
taka
offensive.
droga do
in all
przeprowadzenia
those
tej
matters.
sowietyzacji, do tego
If
zwarcia,
there is
ujednolicenia
a
szeregów,
way to
ona odbywała się przede
Sovietization,
wszystkim
and there
w
was
kontrze chociażby
any
do związków
way,
wyznaniowych, do tej całej
it was
społeczności wyznaniowej
against religious
w Rosji
groups
funkcjonującej, ale również
in
w
Russia,
wolnym świecie, który
but
stawał się powoli zniewolony. Panie profesorze, jak
in the
wyglądała
free
właśnie
world as
polityka
well.
czerwonej
So,
Moskwy
Professor,
w stosunku
what
do
was the
kościoła
policy of the Red Moscow towards different churches, the Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church, and other religious groups? Because we all know that all those churches at some time, at some period, they were very much against the ideology of the evil empire. Let me refer to our motto, the evil empire, and what's been said several times today, including our previous speaker. So the very term evil, or perfect evil, ideal, total evil, that was used by the Bolsheviks already in the 1920s. By the way, this is how they try to justify the crimes performed by the Tsarist system. Later on, this term evolved into an idea of lesser evil. And this is how subordination of smaller nations were justified. So the Tsarist Russia was leading a policy of evil, but it was still lesser evil compared to Turkey, for example, and the Russians. It's all connected to the religious policy. We should remember that the Orthodox Church in the Tsarist Russia was one of the pillars of the empire and the management of the state. Since the synod until 1918, Russia, there was not any patriarch, Orthodox patriarch in Russia in place. The Bolsheviks believe that religion is a great danger to their rule and to their communist ideology. And that's why the policy of fighting with the church, with the Orthodox Church, but also with the Muslim Church. Because the Romanov Empire was very diverse in terms of religions and cultures. We should remember about that. And the territory of Russia and the Soviet Union later on was inhabited by millions of Muslims, but also Roman Catholics, Protestants, and some other smaller religious groups as well. So, fighting with all those religious groups and religions, most of all Catholicism and the Orthodox Church, well, all of that in the process of expansion in the 40s, there was a synod organized to force actually the Ukrainian Greek Catholics to the Orthodox Church, which was subordinate to the communist authorities. During the Second World War, when Stalin decided that he can take advantage of the authority and conversion of some part of the society, then he tried to take advantage of it. Then during the Khrushchev times, again, these fights against the church intensified. So to sum up, the church was maybe not an alternative, but rather for the Bolsheviks, it always constituted a danger, and the church could function only if it cooperated very closely with the authorities. That the game of appearance was the ruling idea of that relationship. And of course, kresne chody were the origins of the first May processions, the religious festivals. So what happened was that the communists used some solutions that were already in place, and they only allowed the religions to be and function if controlled by the state. So Moscow created the policy of religions and religious groups, and Moscow played and took advantage of this religious component, and it's still visible nowadays, right? How about today? We've been talking about foreign policy, the evil empire, about political and military actions, activities, repressions of religious groups. How about the art today? Because you talked about the Soviet art, but let's talk about today. How our contemporary art, how does it look like compared to the Soviet art? Of course, cannot forget about the legacy and tradition of visual arts of the Soviet Union. Let me talk about that again, and let me show you another last slide, actually, which is going to be quite strong and graphic. You'll see two hearts. And those two hearts are shown in St. Petersburg. I think proves and shows a lot about the current iconography. I think that Russia is well aware of the fact that the tools used today have to be modern and have to be able to respond to the youth. So let me show you several slides with different visual forms and how art was used in the period of the Cold War, when the discussion concerning human rights was really important and heated. And those works of art show how the Soviet Union tried to shape the mentality of the youth. No rights, human rights, racial rights were non-existent. And here the Statue of Liberty, a strong symbol for different generations. But what was the effect of that art? Because it works in two directions, in both directions. All those fine art tools used in the Soviet Union created a very strong movement all over the world, including Poland, and resulted in a number of extraordinary works of art. Because ideology, what ensued were responses from all over the world, art responses. You can see Ganja Jaruzelski artwork right there. So the art influence of the Soviet Union on Europe can be seen. And here Mozelewski artwork, where you can see here another, this is an Ukrainian response to that, a grotesque art form. So what there were in a way prophetic responses. And today I think that in the context of the wars, which today the art still is treated as a tool. And what happens is that other art forms and artists in other countries respond to the Russian art tools or art works of art created. And we've got several examples here, like the famous one. So the response of the free world to the propaganda policy and the visual wave of Russia talking about itself is there. So Russia is strong, is protective towards other nations. This is what those works of art try to communicate to us. And here you've got a few examples about, for example, showing the Russian victory in the Great War, Russia depicted, shown as Mother Russia protecting all the nations.
Swoją machinę informacyjną i pokazując każdym możliwym, jakby przez każdy możliwy sposób. To nie tylko jest plakat, to jest
Different means of expression are used, not only works of art, like visual, but for example murals, you can see an example there, and also references to history. We've got here a poster in Petersburg. So this is a totally new visual art language, new ways of communicating to introduce and to use a totally new narrative towards its own citizens. We've got some quotations from Putin's speeches being incorporated in works of art, different symbols, and very simple symbols are used as well. You'll see them soon. And very brave behaviors and actions are shown on different works of art. And here you can see Russia and Ukraine is one nation.
Na terenie Rosji, prawda? Nie trzeba działać dalej, nie trzeba informować dalej, chodzi o akceptację przez społeczeństwo.
It's all about Russian own society and the fact that they should accept the situation. So the art is designed for them mostly. And we've got new iconography, which the young generation respond to very much and very well to. And you can see some new symbols used and present in the public domain. And of course, we've got in the public domain huge posters, informative posters, commonplace all over the world, by the way. And here you've got a very recent example for Mariupol, showing how this new way of this new narrative about history begins to function in the public context. And here are those two hearts I mentioned at the beginning. Two hearts joined together, Mariupol and St. Petersburg. So this is a depiction that is very, very much designed for the young generation, and they, as I said, respond to that quite well.
Taking reference to Professor Sienkiewicz's
oferował jakby wybawienie ludzkości od wszystkich problemów,
Soviet Union actually offered
które doświadczała.
The salvation
Komunizm był też
from all the ailings.
Grupy popierane i to trzeba też o tym powiedzieć.
That's why communism was supported by certain groups. It had its own believers, we could say. In the Soviet Union itself, communism
obrony ludzi biednych, ludzi poniżonych,
very often took reference to the poor,
the
people who were exploited. That's why a huge number of supporters of the Soviet Union came from those social classes, especially from those lower social classes, the poorest ones. And they were somehow protected by the state. These people also had prospects for climbing on the social ladder and receiving state help. Thanks to that, some of those people became supporters of communism and the communist authorities. There are three such groups. The ethnic minorities, that's the first one. But of course, we have to remember not all of them, because if you think about the social minorities on the Polish territory, like Jews or Belarusians, were differentiated to a large extent. But of course, those national minorities were persecuted before the war. That's why the Soviet Union quite aptly played with their feelings of alienation, and in this way they were able to induce them to support them. The second group are the poor people. And the third one is the youth. Young people were the first for whom it was the easiest to adopt the new ideologies. In this way, they felt liberated from the religious enslavement. This was particularly visible in the Soviet Union, but later on, when Poland was Sovietized, this happened also in Poland. From those three groups, the strongest supporters of the communism came from. And I would just like to add a few words to that. Today's conference provoked me to search for the ways of reaching certain social layers, because we deal with a number of different forms of plastic art. Today, of course, we have more contemporary vehicles for that, like social media. So, and we can see it also contemporarily. The young people are easily tempted by those. Today's situation is quite difficult. Almost any of us has some contacts with people in Ukraine. At the beginning of the war, I contacted a few eminent representatives of the world of art in Ukraine. And you have to believe me, the third, the fourth phone call, and they did not respond. But today, so today we've got like this vacuum in the world of art. There is a group of free artists that are not supporters of a particular ideology. So this was what we experienced in Poland, for instance. There was this idea of the art community working in close cooperation with some church communities and groups. We've got really great examples of eminent art. If it comes to iconography, plastic forms, especially in the stream of expressionism.
Oczywiście wypowiadają się jakby
There are certain artists maybe that plead,
tam jest wolna sztuka, to jest bardzo ważne.
but yeah, the question that we should be asking is that whether we deal with
Szanowni
free art
Państwo,
today.
Kończąc ten panel dyskusyjny, tę część,
Concluding this part, this panel, I want to emphasize one more thing. Without a doubt, we deal with the evil empire that was quite, whose internal mechanism of operation was quite well prepared. Whether we see it in different spaces, like the social space, the space of artistic expression, in foreign policies, we see, of course, some examples of the areas that opposed communism, for instance, in Poland. Communism was one of those tools used by Russia in the general expansionist policy. I very often repeat to students, Poland cannot be the communist because it's in opposition to being a Pole.
Kończymy ten panel. Pan profesor jeszcze chciał, tak?
And yeah, there is one more.
Mówiąc o imperium zła i stuleciu jego powstania, tak naprawdę
thing to discuss.
analizujemy jego długie trwanie.
Speaking about the long time of the Soviet Union and its legacy until today, the Soviet Empire created a totalitarian regime system that is quite peculiar, unique. That's the regime that tries to influence people's minds. This aspect of the evil empire and its totalitarian character of influencing also the values and the traditions is very important. So the propaganda and the information war pursued by Russia, as seen today, is one of the most important fronts, actually, of the war fought now in Ukraine. And this is very dangerous today. That's the most dangerous remnant of the Soviet Empire, that it still wants to affect our thoughts. Right. I would like to, of course, invite you to the participation in the next panel. We have two yet today. The first one will be about the wars fought by the evil empire, and the third one will be devoted to the agents and spies. I would like to thank the panelists, especially today, for coming here to Lublin and share their thoughts and opinions with us. Thank you.
Dziękujemy również prowadzącemu i widzimy się o godzinie 12 na następnym panelu.
And the next panel starts at 12 o'clock. Thank you.